Now, I've explained what it takes to make a proper decision, right? So we need all the 4 artifacts that I highlighted before. Now we're going to move on to what are the 4 horsemen, what I call the 4 horsemen of modern decision making. What are the 4 forces that can potentially destroy your decision making processes? And this is going to be about incomplete or imperfect information setting, perverse incentive structures, rooted ideologies, and cognitive biases. These subjects are pretty massive in themselves. We're going to focus primarily on cognitive biases, but let's try to understand together how each of these 4 horsemen impact our decision-making process and render our decision-making process, let's say, suboptimal by default, impossible to assert that we're extracting the highest value by making the right decision. Let's focus on the first horseman, information. Incomplete information setting essentially arises from 4 important underlying phenomena. You have incomplete information setting when you have market asymmetries, data availability issues. You have a lack of data. That you cannot collect more data on a subject. You have a time constraint. You need to make decisions under tight schedule without being able to observe the different outcomes that could be taken. And you have very kind of like dynamic environments. You have environments that change quite a lot and that lead to new phenomenon arising within the environment. When you have any of this property present, let's say in the decision-making process that you want to do, you start having uncertainty in the assumptions that you make. And this is precisely what, let's say, renders improper the priors that you set, right? If you don't have the right data, if you don't understand the market in which you operate, if you have tight, time constraint, you're not going to be able to figure out, let's say, the potential value that you would get from different decisions in the world. And so you would not be able to set your priors properly, and you would essentially not have a proper search space. Now, perverse incentive structure is another very important, let's say, horseman that can destroy our decision-making process. It usually arises from short-termism, hierarchical rigidity, individualistic culture, right? When you have a culture that's very self-centered, as soon as you start organizing people into groups, you have conflicting individualistic incentives. You have different wants. You have different people who want different things, and therefore you don't have a proper alignment. And that leads pretty straightforwardly to system gaming, which itself is just essentially what leads to distorted reward. You do not have the proper reward associated with different outcomes and therefore different decisions that you could make. Then what happens when you have rooted ideology, and how does it impact modern decision making? Well, first of all, we need to understand that rooted ideology comes from group affiliation, just blind belonging to groups, educational system, like biased educational system that push a prevailing set of ideologies to whatever new generation is let's say growing up right now in a society. Media authority, you have essentially just media that acts as an authority figure and that essentially push, let's say, traditional belief, traditional in the sense of governance bodies' decisions to push certain ideologies. And then finally, you have a lot of preferences, right? Like you have personal preferences that are, personal experiences that are developed over time and that make you believe that something is right or wrong. When you have these conditions, you have rooted ideologies that directly lead to a resistance to change. But what does resistance to change actually mean? That is for us in our decision system. This is something that constrains action, right? Like if you are resistant to change, you do not want to go down a certain road because you know, or you think that you know, based on your ideologies, that this is not the right path to take. You never try anything new, and you constrain the action space in the world of decision making here. And as we saw in the previous slides, constrained actions essentially leads to a repeating status quo, to a lack of exploration and a lack of generation of new value based on trying new outcomes. And that's a pretty problematic issue here for our decision-making systems. And then finally, what is going to be one of the most important subjects that we're going to explore in this course: individual or group-based cognitive biases, which arise from the over-representation of emotional factors, the cognitive overload that you experience when you cannot deal effectively with information, and the social influence that is all around us and that you sometimes cannot cope with properly. These cognitive biases lead to inaccurate perception of the world. We're going to get into that at details later on, but for now, these inaccurate perceptions are essentially just systematic deviation from understanding of the truth. And when you have inaccurate perception, you do not know how to figure out what the real truth is. You have what I call a cursory outcome mapping. You cannot properly map the different outcomes that exist. And if you do not know what are the different options, the different outcomes that you could take, you by definition do not know what decisions result in the highest value for these different outcomes. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on cognitive biases, so stick around for that.